Welcome to the Freight Project podcast, brought to you by Ceresis, a North American third-party logistics company providing shippers transportation management, technology, and solutions.
On today's The Freight Project podcast, I welcome Keith Farnsworth of MyCarrierTMS.com to speak about how data is being used in improving freight operations today to compete and win. Just like Billy Beane of the Oakland Athletics used data with a Moneyball mindset to win using small ball and disrupt how managers went about running strategies and tactics in baseball to win. On the episode, you'll hear more about the Moneyball mindset to improve freight operations from Keith as he answers the following questions. What are the parallels to the Moneyball approach or mindset that you are now seeing in the world of freight that's improving freight operations? With TMS adoption rates still relatively low compared to ERP adoption, is it a pipe dream for shippers to expect more advanced analytics and data? Why or why not? What kind of data and metrics should shippers specifically be looking at to realistically adopt a Moneyball mindset today and apply the use of data to improving freight operations without waiting for more advanced analytics? Do shippers have more leverage if freight pricing is down year over year? How are shippers and carriers supposed to collect that data and then know how to analyze it to improve freight operations today and track closer to their goals? How does Keith see the current state of TMS, and what should shippers expect from a good TMS today? We hope you enjoy this episode of the Freight Project Podcast.
Well, hello, Keith. It's fantastic to have you on the Freight Project Podcast. It's exciting to have someone like yourself who is also in the TMS space to talk about how the industry is leaning more and more on data, especially through analytics, to get actionable data in order to continuously improve and optimize desired outcomes for their freight management practices. So I think you're a great guest to come to talk about that subject, because not only do you represent My Carrier TMS, offering solutions, but you're also a big baseball fan. And baseball, like freight, it went through a transformation using data as a differentiation with the rise of Moneyball mindsets and Billy Beane. And of course, Brad Pitt is really Billy Beane secretly, or maybe he was just the actor who played him in a movie. But you use small ball in a Moneyball mindset and data to win over brute force. And in the early 2000s, when this idea came around, it was the steroid brute force, and that might be a sore subject for some folks out there. But before we get into that conversation, can you tell us a bit more about yourself, your company, and your experience in the world of freight?
Adam, thanks first for having me on today. I've watched some of your material for several years, and it is really kind of exciting to be able to join you today and talk about two of my passions and how those worlds collide in baseball and logistics. So I got my start about 20 years ago actually working for an LTL asset-based company. So I started at the entry level. I actually worked the dock, loaded the trailers, unloaded the trailers, and really got to see how that world operates. So several years into that business, I continued to evolve, worked into several management roles, and eventually went to work for a 3PL at the very beginning stages, kind of during that 3PL boom phase. And so I worked for a 3PL for about 10 years. And then most recently, after working for an asset-based company and for a non-asset-based company, I joined forces here at My Carrier TMS. And I'm using some of those skills and some of that knowledge to deliver solutions on the technology side. So it's really kind of exciting times for us.
Well, very good. And I think we ourselves went over an API project about a year ago. And I think what we found is, a good percentage, more than 80%, were pretty savvy on things like API, but a good 20% were not. And it was kind of interesting to see that. And I think coming from a marketing background myself, I was just naturally expecting that would be a much easier project than it was. And like I said, 80% of it was good, but that last 20%, we really had to work with that carrier to educate them on API and, how to make that process and connecting to our TMS and data flows much more simple. So we got to get the connection started right first before we can start those easy data flows and gathering. And without it, it's much more difficult. So thanks for telling us your background and, with your love of baseball. And folks, I got to make sure I get Keith's baseball podcast and his writings and make sure I put a link on this publishing page to go check that out. And I'm definitely going to be sending it to our freight desk manager, Chris Longner, who just absolutely loves the Cubs. So he'll love to see that. But one of the things I really want to focus on today for our conversation is that use of data to really separate those shippers, carriers, or 3PLs away from the competition, and how data will continue to be one of the most important assets that any shipper, anybody in this industry will come to find and look at. And it's really all about that Moneyball mindset, right? Where you take small ball fundamental things and you use that as your competitive differentiation. So let's try and bring those two worlds together. What are the parallels to that approach of Moneyball mindset that you're now seeing in the world of freight and freight management?
And I love this analogy too, because, with baseball, and if you watch the Moneyball movie, basically what Billy Beane and his organization with the Oakland Athletics did is they knew they weren't going to compete against the big market teams. They didn't have the staffs. They didn't have the budgets. So they had to think a little differently. They had to think outside of the box. And they looked at, how do we produce a winning team by the numbers? What are we trying to produce? We're trying to produce RBIs. We're trying to produce runs so that we can win games. And what we're seeing as API technology continues to develop and it becomes more and more mainstream, small to medium-sized shippers are now gaining access to some of those actionable analytics so that they can actually take their own unique approach towards winning. And they have to develop their own recipe. What's winning to us? And what data do we need to look at so that we can make sure we're on top of what our game is? Well,
and I think with, Billy Beane, he had some good comments that I think are applicable to the freight world, right? You said there was a 3PL boom in 2008. I think that was, brought about shippers looking for solutions and lacking the resources or the capital investment. Maybe it was due to, the recession that was faced then. And so 3PLs kind of came in and were able to, give them that shot in the arm where the shippers maybe didn't have the resources to do that on their own. And there was, still, I think even in that pain, which can create change, from my perspective, when I came into the world of freight 7 years ago, it still seemed kind of old school, kind of blue collar, that it was still a generational kind of divide where, there wasn't a lot of folks who were willing to adopt new technology. They wanted to kind of go with their old ways. What are some dangers with that mindset, and how do you convince, the industry to start looking towards adopting data? How do you get them to change those old practices?
Well, I think you don't have to look very far to see examples of carriers or companies that failed to adopt to technology and that are not doing so great in 2019. I mean, we actually lost two fairly large LTL companies in the space in the last, probably 12 months. New England Motor Freight and Lakeville Motor are no longer in business. Those two companies weren't necessarily technology leaders or innovators in the space. And so with all things, as we choose or choose not to adopt technology, that kind of determines whether or not we're going to stay current and be able to offer current solutions to our customers. I was listening to another podcast actually this morning, and it referenced the Fortune 500 companies. The original list, I think it was in 1955. Only 10% of those companies are around today. And those are the biggest 500 companies, several years ago. And that's because they didn't adopt. They didn't change as technology changed, as times changed, and they basically just went away. And so we all have that risk of whether or not we're going to adopt some of this technology and be a leader in the space, or if we're going to wait behind and react to how things are going. So we actually work with some of the top carriers in the LTL industry that are innovative carriers like Old Dominion, ABF, Saia, and we partner with them to continue to help them build out and stay in front of that technology. So we're advising them on what APIs to build out next, what they can focus on to make sure that they're ahead of the curve as technology continues to evolve.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that you all are out there kind of leading that charge with the carrier side. We definitely need that in the industry. Whether it's by forced regulation on the ELD side, which will open up more data, or just simple ease of doing business between platforms, because integration and data visibility are going to become key in the next data frontier. So let's get a little more, get more deeply into that data and analytics discussion. Traditionally, the world of freight and TMS providers have been pretty successful at providing descriptive analytics, or what happened, and even diagnostic analytics. Why did it happen? Although, some TMS and freight shippers still struggle with kind of those more rudimentary data analytics gathering. But the next phase of true actionable data, and that's the key word that you said earlier, actionable, that really will move the needle. The entire point of a Moneyball mindset is predictive, or what will happen, and prescriptive analytics, or how can we make it happen. With those TMS adoption rates still low, and we're still having to kind of, lead the conversation from a technology standpoint to change some mindsets, with just simple integration between like a TMS and ERP. Is it a pipe dream for shippers to expect more advanced analytics in data? Why or why not?
I definitely don't think it's a pipe dream. We see it, and that's one of the beautiful parts about what I do and what I enjoy about my job is I get to see the innovation continuing to happen. And like I said before, we're driving it on the carrier side. And as more and more carriers get behind allowing this API to channel through and touch different parts of the shipper's business, they get visibility to all of this. And so most of the shippers are already looking at, metrics. And I've heard you talk about it on other shows. They're looking at claims. They're looking at on-time percentage. They're tracking their cost, their transit days, and they're all grading, or should be grading, the carriers based on their own metrics. But what I see as the big gain out of more and more adoption on the API technology is just the overall visibility. I mean, pretty soon, once more and more carriers continue to build this out, customers will be able to pull in all of this information in real time. They'll be able to get all their documents instantaneously. They'll be able to pass information to their dispatchers, at 8 o'clock in the morning, at noon, as opposed to that carrier not getting the information until 7 o'clock at night, till that driver comes back to the terminal and invoices it. And as these carriers become more efficient and the shippers become more efficient, it drives better relationships between the two companies. And that's really what we're here for, is to try and help through technology improve those relationships.
Yeah, so I agree. I think we're on the cusp of a really data rich future. But when it comes to even predictive type things, and with Billy Beane, it was focusing on the leading metrics that might result in a run or an RBI, and really focusing on those things. But even beyond predictive, it's still vital that shippers and the freight industry is just simply looking at data. So let's talk about that. What kind of data and metrics should shippers specifically be looking at to realistically adopt a Moneyball mindset today and apply the use of data that they can gather now to improve without waiting for the industry to provide those more advanced analytics that might be coming with, AI and machine learning?
So they should be all looking at how their freight moves and how each carrier performs within that. So a large portion of that is, what do they do with the freight? Do they deliver it on time? Do they handle it claim free? Do they have a quicker transit or a slower transit? And how does that cost factor into that? So those are probably the four biggest buckets. And the struggle that I see most often is that the shippers don't have a real way of measuring those tools. A lot of the market, still probably 80% of LTL shippers, are not using technology to measure those four metrics: claims, on-time percentage, transit days, and cost. And so step one is obviously finding a system that works best for you, that allows you to quickly view and grade those carriers based on those key metrics.
And what's the best tool you think right now that shippers could look at?
Well, it depends. It depends on what the size is. Obviously what we've put together here is something that we find that a lot of customers like. The My Carrier system is one of those systems that you can tap into, and it can be a tool for you to utilize and to connect your carriers to. But to be honest, there's a lot of options out there.
Yeah. And I think it's going to require savvy buyers, but I think it's incumbent upon, guys like me and you to educate the industry on what these tools can do for you. I mean, I could not be a logistics manager, and maybe it's a lot like when I, was a marketing manager back in 2010. The marketing industry was kind of in a upheaval, right? It was going from traditional newspaper. I used to actually sell old print ads at a newspaper, printed, had ink. It would get on your fingers. It was neat. But, quickly, the newspaper industry suffered quite a bit and started moving digital. We started digitizing advertising and marketing, and it was confusing, right? There were so many offerings, so much marketing technology, MarTech, as they called it. And, I ended up where I am today. I use a lot of technology, but what I think it's become in a much more mature place, and what logistics and freight managers will see is that, it's pretty important to use tools that are effective for your goals. And there's so many tools out there. There's so many different TMS, right? There's the Ceresys Radar. There's My Carrier TMS. There's, offerings from the giants like Mercury Gate. Cubex is a pure play SaaS out there. We all know these things, but it really just depends on what are your goals as a shipper, right? And I think whenever you're talking to carriers in your role as the director of carrier relations and management there at My Carrier TMS, you're really more focused on solving problems for them and solving problems for your shippers. So when it comes to a TMS, what would be the advice you'd give either shippers or even carriers who are either offering a TMS to their customers or partnering with you to be included in the TMS? What would you say to shippers out there on how to best navigate and find what they should expect from a good TMS today?
See, I love this question because there are so many different options out there that for a lot of people, this can be a stressful question. There's so many solutions to go with. I guess I have a few things that I look for and how I grade whether or not this is a viable solution for me. So first and foremost, I want a system that's agile. I want something that I can train my staff in relatively quickly. I want something that's going to continue to be developed. For example, we develop on a 2-week sprint cycle. So what our system is today is going to be different than what it is next Friday when we release again. So we're constantly taking feedback from carriers, from shippers, from customers to develop this software into what it's going to be 6 months from now. And it's going to be a lot different. So agility to me is important. We have some systems that are legacy style systems that large shippers use that just don't continue to change as technology changes. So agility is important to me. Also, is it affordable? Can I, as a small to medium-sized shipper, afford both the maintenance of this system or just the onboarding and the subscription of it? So if I'm, a $1 million transportation spend company, I'm probably not going to go out and spend $20,000 to $30,000 to integrate a large TMS. I'm going to look for something that better suits my needs. So is it agile? Is it affordable? And also I want to know, is it efficient? Is it going to help my processes? Because at the end of the day, technology to me is something that I utilize that makes my life simpler. And so if you see some of the technology that's been adopted in the world the last, 10 or 15 years, we all utilize Google because it's easy. We can get answers from it relatively quickly. My 7-year-old, when he walks into my in-laws' house, the first thing he says is, "Hey, Google," and then he asks a question because he can get an answer right away. It's convenient. It's easy to use. And that's my last one, is how easy is the system to actually navigate and to use? If it's going to be something that requires a ton of training, and that as you get more and more use out of it and you push it to more and more of your departments, if there's struggle internally in adopting it, then you probably have the wrong product. And I guess the easiest way to explain that is most of us have probably taken an Uber in the last, 3 or 4 years. When you downloaded the Uber app, did somebody stand over your shoulders and explain to you how to use it? No, it was just easy enough to use. You just called a car, you hopped in, you paid them, whatever the fee was, and you moved on with your life. And if your system is intuitive enough, and if they've done their job right, you don't really need training to be able to utilize the system. So those are the 4 things that I look at in trying to judge whether or not this is a viable solution for my company.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think from both of our angles, as Ceresys and My Carrier TMS, I think it's just an exciting time to see, especially over the last year and a half. And maybe you felt this too, as even deeper with shippers than I myself am, and carriers especially. But the industry is definitely gaining more adoption in technology itself. I think there's better tools. There's more money, VC money flowing into it. There's a lot of competition that's only going to be good for the marketplace. And it's just going to make everybody up their game. And hey, man, I mean, is it not good for the economy? From a patriotic standpoint, as an American, I would have to say, let's get some great technology tools to make freight shippers more efficient, because it reduces the cost of our products that we buy every day. And it just makes us more efficient and more competitive as a country. So technology adoption is super important, and it has a larger goal. So let's think about it that way, shippers, and not convince you to get a TMS, but do the patriotic thing. just like baseball's America's pastime, let's make TMS America's pastime. Are you with me, Keith?
I am definitely with you.
Maybe we're biased on that front, but hey, if we can get our kids, your 7-year-old interested in freight and my 13 and 9-year-old in freight, then maybe we're changing the world and displacing baseball with TMS. Maybe too big of a goal, but we'll do our best.
I like it.
Well, Keith, I appreciate you coming on to the Freight Project podcast and offering your thoughts on all things data, technology, and the importance of technology adoption, especially that last point, ease of use. It must be easy. A lot of bloated systems out there. So if you're a shipper, make sure you're looking at a few TMSs. Make sure you're getting something that meets your goals. There's a lot of options out there, so ask the questions. If you have any for Keith on that front, make sure you check him out. I'll leave a link to go find out more from him on LinkedIn, but also a link to My Carrier TMS to check them out as well. So Keith, have a good day. And for all of those listeners of the Freight Project podcast out there, we'll see you on the next one.